Thank you, everyone, and good morning. I am not Martin Weiss. I do not have a PhD. I can't speak for DoD, and these aren't exactly my slides. So just by way of introduction, I am very happy today to be here in sort of Martin's place, helping to outline a little bit more about what OCUDU is beyond the very specifics that were discussed about the software development project that DeepSig and SRS are leading. The shutdown has prohibited Martin from making this presentation himself. He and I have had a chat, but I think more importantly, it lets me spend a minute highlighting the National Spectrum Consortium's role as a coordinating entity, sort of public-private partnership, something we do in a number of respects on a number of projects, and something we will be doing here for the OCUDU project as well. Again, aside from the joke piece, I do not speak for DoD. I am here to represent the project and to talk about what I know to be their motivations, etc. But just to be clear, I don't work for the government. The other thing I'll mention is that I will try to save a little time for some questions at the back end, but I don't mind at all being interrupted. So if you say something you want to ask about, please just fire away. The last thing I'll say is, because these are not my slides, you're going to have to watch me put my glasses on so I can read my notes. So, all right. So hoping here to cover just a few minutes this morning, a little bit more about the FutureG office at DoD, Audible USD Army, what their motivations and goals and mission looks like, how that fits into what the overall OCUDU set of programs is. And you'll see that little red S is there on purpose because the project that was outlined earlier and that'll be discussed in much more detail during a panel later today is one of a set of things under this OCUDU effort. And then, what is it that DoD is trying to achieve, or what at the end of the day, what does end state success look like, both with the software project, with the OCUDU program, and more broadly with the initiatives that OUSDRNE and the FutureG office have put forward. So that's what we're going to cover, with a specific focus again on the things that matter here for this group and OCUDU. All right. So a little bit about what is behind FutureG and its goals. I think one of the things that I tend to think about when I think about this is the genesis of the FutureG program and office from the beginning. And it comes about as a result of the race to 5G, whatever that was, 7 or something years ago. And it comes about out of the realization that, prior to certainly the LTE, WiMAX wars, that was really the last time we had competing standards in the mobile industry in a big way, more than one RAN platform competing in a big way, especially competing even on an individual country by country basis. And so when you had multiple competing standards, you had separate lines of R&D, you had separate thrusts, and therefore whatever total dollars were going to building new RAN technology were split in among those efforts. And it meant that if DoD was going to go out with a bespoke request for communications equipment and technology, the amount of money that they could put behind an R&D effort was roughly competitive or was attractive to folks doing development in that space. What you see with 5G now, predictably beyond and forever, when you consolidate worldwide R&D on one technology platform, there really isn't a way in which, even with its giant budget, DoD can spend enough money to drive specific bespoke R&D on specific platforms. In other words, if you are a program office in DoD and you put out a request for a communication solution or a solution that requires a wide area mobile communications network, what you're going to get back is some flavor of 3GPP compliant software or RAN software with a spin, with a flavor, with extra security, with a particular feature, et cetera. What you're going to get back is some kind of industry standard, because $1 trillion plus, someone probably knows that number better than I do, of worldwide R&D just has gotten consolidated behind one set. And so whereas it used to be that you could, claim a little bit of credit that you had, military tech spec comms gear, well, now the little glass rectangle we all carry around with us is as good or better in some ways than some of that bespoke technology. And so what does that look like from the point of view of DoD, and how can they adapt to that world now, where they have to be a part of the development of the global standard, try to influence it. They have to adapt and utilize commercial tech in a different way. You know, DoD talks a lot about, let's use off-the-shelf hardware and adapt it for, you know, scalability and supply chain and to get things cheaper. In this case, it's almost a survival question, right? It's almost, you know, you have to be a part of this ecosystem to drive it in the places you need, or you're on the receiving end of whatever it is the industry decides to go with. And so it's a little bit of a different place that DoD is in. And that's, I think, my personal summary on some of the motivations behind the FutureG office. Like, how do they get themselves in a position to mold, shape, adapt to this environment, and shape it for the benefit of the warfighter, or shape it for the benefit of DoD and its mission. So, you know, I keep that in mind a lot when we're talking about the projects and programs that OUSD-R&E puts through NSC and that we collaborate with them on. It's less of a, here we are, we're throwing out a big R&D challenge, industry, come meet us and do what we say. It's more of a influence campaign in the background. Here are the things we need. Here's where the industry is. How can we mold and shape and push and guide and prod it in the direction we need? And so that's OCUDU fits very much, in my opinion. It's a very, I think maybe a little biased, and it's a clever way of helping to achieve that mission. All right. A little more about the FutureG office. You can see here some of the various different lines they have. There's sort of 5 areas. The OCUDU project fits very clearly within the resilient and open commercial solutions chunk here. But you can also see there are a number of other technology thrusts that the FutureG office has that fit very well with NSC and our mission and our membership. So you can see why it is that we are so closely aligned and spend so much time with the FutureG team. You know, Isaac, you just launched a working group on that. Agile Spectrum Operations, that's kind of in the name. The other thing I'll mention here are these cross-cutting topics. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but it's, you know, the standards piece, as I said and just outlined, right? There is a massive international effort well beyond the control of the U.S. government or DoD or any particular vendor, headed toward 6G and the continual evolution of the 3GPP standard. FutureG and OUSD-R&E treat it as a part of their mission to try to make sure that they are both closely aligned with where that's going, understand it, and try to influence it. So that's a big sort of cross-cutting thrust here. The second one, I think that it comes up, and you hear there's a lot of lip service paid to workforce development. It's incredibly important. I think there's an interesting piece that I'll talk about in the next couple of slides about not just literal workforce development, how many trained RF engineers can we have in the U.S. and elsewhere working on these problems, but also how do the tools and techniques and platforms that are a part of training those folks, how can those be influenced and how can we benefit them? Because if all those tools are extraordinarily expensive and proprietary and hard to get access to and limited, then the development work and the innovation and the sort of messing around that someone in a PhD program or learning can do is limited as well. And so you stifle innovation. You don't have that sort of creativity. You make things harder. You make it, required that, researchers form, long-term, complicated, extensive partnerships with individual commercial entities, which is, as many of us know, very hard for them to do. So there's an interesting wrinkle there that we'll touch on in a minute that I do think is important, and it gets thrown in this bucket of workforce development. And a lot of times people kind of roll their eyes or, oh yeah, we need more engineers. But there's an important piece there to consider. So again, as I mentioned, this keystone project that DeepSync and SRS are running now through the NSC and our OTA with the partnership of OUSD-R&E and others, that is one of a sort of nested set of programs and goals for OCUDU. This may be a little bit new. I think this is a new framework, so I'll spend a minute here and talk about it a little bit. You'll see the OCUDU public repository. I mean, that's what everybody's, when we're talking about OCUDU, that's what people are thinking of, right? That's the, open source software project and community hosted within the Linux Foundation, labeled OCUDU. That's where you're going to, get access to and put back open source software calls. But that's just one piece of the overall puzzle here. That repository, again, is open source, public, managed by the Linux Foundation. But that is not necessarily the ultimate place where the innovation as far as OUSDRNE and the FutureG office is going to come from, right? There will be a private or less public 5G.mil repository, one that contains, you can imagine, things that aren't going to go back up into the public repository, but it's going to continually take input and feedback and new innovation from that open source development. Test it, vet it. Again, you'll see here, red team it, right? Add security enhancements or other components and make it such that you would then have a rapidly evolving code base that can be used by folks who want to build solutions for DoD over the top of that. And so this is, it's important to make that, to note that, just because I think, I think so it can be some amount of eye rolling. It's like, oh yeah, DoD is going to put, open source software into all their networks. I don't think that's going to happen. Well, first of all, folks have thought this through. That's not that. I mean, second of all, it also exists currently, right? Like there's plenty of Linux implementations all over some of the tech that ends up in for military use. But beyond that, yes, there is a whole other set of programs and considerations here. They're all built, however, on the foundation of that public repository. If you don't have the repository, and more importantly, at the top of the diagram here, if you don't have that community ecosystem of innovation, if you don't have developers and innovators contributing to and using that public repository to build their own commercial solutions and therefore making it robust and scalable, if you don't get that flywheel to spin, you don't get the things below the line. And so I think it's just important to kind of consider the relationship here. And in some ways, right, that's the FutureG office's mission and goal, and that's the work they will be doing, is participating in, tracking, helping to guide some of the open source efforts, and then deciding when and how to pull those down and feed them into the, the 5G.mil ecosystem below the line. And obviously I should say, not everything you'll see, I don't know if you can tell from the little slide there, that there are some things from there that will go back up, not all, it's a dotted line. But the idea is that they will also be active, to the degree possible, active participants in building that ecosystem. I think all of this is to say that the goal is to make DoD solutions more agile in a rapidly changing RF environment. And Martin threw out of something that I didn't vet, but I believe him, that he has heard that, in Ukraine, for instance, the RF environment is changing almost weekly, and they have to adapt almost weekly to new challenges, frequency challenges, jamming challenges, other, EW challenges. And so if what you're looking for is that flexible adaptability, the way in which things have been done previously, custom dev, long cycles, it's just not really going to work. Okay. A little more on the project timeline for OCUDU. So, the team and award were in place roughly a month ago-ish, a little more. And there is a phase 1 cycle that is underway. Currently, however, the entire period of performance, the project that DeepSig and srsRAN and the team has signed up for is a 3-year project. And it's again, call it training wheels, call it a flywheel. You're looking to get this initial push from the OCUDU team, from SRS and from DeepSig, to get the initial code there, get the ecosystem built, create the governance under the Linux Foundation, but then to continually build and develop additional solutions beyond that for the next 2 years to kind of get that flywheel to spin. The trick here is going to be, however, that as it gets rolling, you've got to be adding developers, partners, contributors. I think this room is full of the first cohort of people who will be a part of that, right? Because you've been a part of the SRS project for a long time now. You're here to hear about more of it. And you are the initial cohort, or you're the initial piece that's going to sort of fit into that puzzle. The goal, once the initial software stack is loaded is then to rapidly build that community. And you'll hear, I think somebody from LF is going to speak a little bit later about their goals there. A little slide later on that shows where we all fit in, but NSC is kind of the bridge between those two worlds, right? If the Linux Foundation is focused on building the open source ecosystem, which will include companies and contributors from other countries, from who cannot be a part of the NSC and what we do based on our partnership with the U.S. government and DoD, we are the place where the government, the Linux Foundation, and the community can come together and hash out exactly how this is going to go and how we're going to kind of build that complicated balance you saw on the previous slide. And so, we take that as a part of our mission. We are working to figure out exactly how that's all going to work in terms of, community collaboration. But that's our goal and our role there throughout this effort is, if the LF folks hit the ground running to build the biggest, broadest open source community that they can in the best way that they know how, because that's their specialty, it is our goal to interface with that the best that we can and help the government interface that with the best that we can in any number of ways. All right. Oops, I went the wrong way. All right. So what exactly is DoD trying to get out of this, right? So there's one way to think about this is, in today's environment, if DoD put out a very important bespoke requirement to build a network function or feature at the same time that T-Mobile asked for a different one, and just threw that out to the world and said, hey, who's going to do this for us? Who do you think at this moment is going to get answered first? And I tend to think that the market will chase the bigger dollars and the bigger opportunity. And if that's always going to be the case, then how is it that DoD can get their priorities met easily? The dual use piece here then is not just, in some cases, right, DoD looks for dual use in order to make things faster and cheaper and more sustainable sort of supply chain. In this case, it's a little bit extra here, right? It's actually, how do they get their priorities built? Because if the standard goes off in a particular direction that doesn't meet the needs that DoD may have, it may be hard to get back from there. It may be hard to come back down that path. They may have to sort of just consider that a loss. So instead, how can they get their needs met sooner? How can they influence the standards without being able to control them or contribute to them directly in many cases? And this is where I want to talk just a minute about some of the workforce development piece. If you think about what the platform that is used for innovation as a piece of education, in other words, the tool that ends up in the lab where your budding PhD researcher bangs away at their new potential idea. If that tool is an open source tool into which DoD and the DoD ecosystem has had some input, then slowly but surely that becomes the baseline for innovation. If some of that innovation ends up being very valuable for commercial use and ends up in the standard, then what you have done is sort of pulled through the DoD-based open source innovation platform as becoming something of the de facto standard for innovation in the standard in the first place. So yes, at a baseline, it is important to have more engineers, more US-based engineers building US-based radio solutions for national security purposes. Everybody's heard that story. But even more so, more subtly, is there a way in which to make it such that instead of a lot of the innovation being done on platforms that are developed in other countries or by other folks, or in some cases, right, you hear that innovation isn't happening because the researchers and academics can't get access in the first place, right? So there are some radio manufacturers who just don't let you break into their code in a way that lets you be innovative and play around and mess around and build something new. And so can this be a part of building that more flexible, more innovative ecosystem? That's another important goal here for OCUDU. And it builds upon some things that, I personally worked on and others, the power platforms and some of the other research platforms, where I saw this struggle firsthand, right? I saw folks say, like, but for this, I can't get beyond this because it's not, I don't have access. I'm not allowed. It doesn't fit the commercial mission of that partner. So that's another important piece here. And that leads to, what is it that DoD and others are hoping to achieve with the OCUDU software? Can't possibly have a DoD slide deck without the words use case in it. It's not possible. Must have them. But, importantly, right, obviously they're trying to support their own internal use cases. As I mentioned, they're trying to support and influence the international standards making procedures to the best that they can. As we talked about, innovation and entrepreneurship, and specifically U.S.-based innovation entrepreneurship in RF and in the RAN, which we all know has been slightly lacking, and the workforce development piece. It also should be noted the supply chain diversity and resilience thing as well, right? The more innovators and companies you bring to this ecosystem, the more resilient the supply chain gets, the less likely you are beholden to any one particular set of radio vendors or others, which also causes issues. So a few of the, more obvious use cases here that DoD has. As I mentioned, we are about to kick off an effort that NSC will be helping with on integrated sensing and communications. That's an important part of this, and likely some of the OCUDU innovation will be fed into that process, and those two things will mutually benefit from each other. On the spectrum sharing side, we also, obviously, that's a big focus at NSC, and you can imagine there'll be some additional spectrum sharing projects that might be able to take advantage of OCUDU and the innovation that comes out of it. The other thing that I will mention here is that the FutureG office already has underway or in place MOUs with the Homeland Security folks, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, NSF, and others. And you could see OCUDU becoming a part of a sort of a foundation for a whole of government approach to 6G and FutureG, right? So if this is successful, both as the software platform on which some of these solutions are built, but also, as I mentioned, as the sort of go-to educational tool, in some ways, the Berkeley Unix of RF development, right? It's just the one that everybody gets trained on, everybody uses, everybody's comfortable with, and therefore sort of enters the bloodstream as a part of this innovation cycle. Does that help meet FutureG's specific use case related goals, but then also their broader industry related goals? And I think it's an open question, but an important one. So it is not, I didn't make these slides, but I will repeat what Martin told me, which is that it is not an accident that one of these vendors is colored in red, and that one happens to be the one that ends up outside the little OCUDU bubble. But take that for what it could be. But if you think about, the current way in which this is, the standards development process is working, where you have, some of the biggest players banging away at the 3GPP process, as many of you know even better than I do, individually trying to gain influence. You could imagine if OCUDU becomes a robust and important ecosystem for the federal government and for other innovators, you could imagine some of those vendors pooling their time, effort, and resources together, developing on and then furthering the development of OCUDU. And if that gets traction and gathers enough steam and gathers enough international attention and participation, you can imagine that joint process influencing the standards making in some ways. And you could see that as a way that, both helps consolidate some of the industry's innovation cycles and also allows the U.S. federal government and DoD specifically to track more closely and maybe even have a little bit of influence on that process. And that, I think, is, some part of the biggest, hairiest, audaciousest goals behind OCUDU, beyond just here's an open source software platform. But is there a way in which this leads to a change in the development cycle and the standards making cycle on the long term? And it's an open question. I mean, again, that's not a definitive statement I am making, but something I think that is in people's minds, and I think is a real possibility. Even if you don't get quite that far, that audacious, do you create a self-reinforcing community of interest where, again, it forms a counterbalance to some of the standards making influence that other countries and other companies have that people have been concerned about for a long time? Can you jointly pool effort there? All right. It's obvious, but I'll say it. It's hard to grow and establish a new US-based RAN innovation ecosystem with the amount of vertical integration you see in the marketplace today, right? You see companies who, very much have closed ecosystems. They're looking to capture business by getting you in their sort of vertical software and hardware stacks. And the more places where you can go and enter additional innovation and open source opportunity here, the better for everybody. You also have the opportunity, again, as I mentioned, to create a platform for academic and entrepreneurial innovation. The more open source, the more folks have access to, can see what's in the code, can play with it, can change it, can modify it, can adapt it without having to pay or ask for permission, the more likely you are to get sort of strange, new, crazy ideas that leak out and become good ideas. Faster path to innovation, more test beds, more prototypes. Love to see that. That's kind of our bread and butter at NSC. The other thing that Martin mentioned, which I hadn't thought of, which I felt was a really good point to make, is you could imagine some of the results of some of the data sets that come off of OCUDU-based networks and projects becoming training sets for AI RAN models, because, again, they won't be based on proprietary software stacks and proprietary environments. They'll be based on an open standard. More likely that you're going to get those things to become public, and the more public they are, the more they can become a generic or an accessible training set for more people. So there's a lot of potential good opportunity here, and that's if my goal here in delivering these slides on Martin's behalf is to sort of give you a window into what the FutureG office is thinking about beyond just the obvious. We need to have open source software stack built by April and then a community launched within a year. Those are obvious. Those are important. Those are big milestones. This is a little bit more of the sort of supporting structure and framework underneath that thinking. Okay. And the last few pieces here before I leave a couple of minutes for questions. Is OCUDU a platform for innovation? If it is, what kind of innovation, and what are the critical success factors to making that innovation successful? I think the answer to number one hopefully is yes. By the time I'm done with the last few minutes, I am a huge supporter, again, having been through our program and some other things, of real world prototyping, testing, demonstration as a foundation for innovation. Lots of, there's a lot of white papers. There's a lot of tabletop exercises, a lot of reports. Very hard to substitute in this business, connecting thousands of devices and watching them interact with the environment. Very difficult to really understand exactly how this is going to work and how it's going to scale, and what else could be built upon it until you see it out there in the world. And so I think that's rapid prototyping and rapid large-scale prototyping, I think, is a huge piece of why this is an important platform. This point about co-production, right? I mean, that is the benefit, that is the vision of the open source piece of this, right? So very unlikely that wide-scale, brand new thinking, blue sky thinking comes about literally in one of those vertical stacks, all contained within one set of engineering goals and company goals and incentives, right? The innovation, I think, that the FutureG office wants to see and that we want to see, that I think would be important to see come out of all of this, is both, again, the standards bit, which we spent a bunch of time talking about, the services, basically the DoD related use cases, what can you build? And then beyond that, the capabilities, right? What are the new capabilities that could end up in a network built on open source, an open source framework? And are those capabilities something outside of what anybody has thought possible or fit within anybody's particular business case and reason that they went out and built a solution? It's Martin's joke, but I'll make it anyway. Yes, also, are you going to see innovation in the applications? Number one, we have seen that a bunch. Exactly how successful it is as a pull through for some of this remains to be seen. I think specifically, he's making reference on the OpenRAN side. But beyond that, also, right, there is the possibility that the applications that people build won't actually be for the benefit of DoD, and it could actually be to the detriment, right? You have an open source project, people could build applications that actually we don't want to see happen, and that make things worse and not better. On the other hand, that's also a very good way in which to track what the vulnerabilities are, right? It happens in the open, it happens open source, it happens collaboratively. You see it. It's not a question as to, oh, I didn't know that was possible. You knew it was possible because you saw somebody start it. And now you also, because it's open source, you know how you might be able to thwart it or chase it or find it. So there's good reasons, there's reasons good and bad why the application piece, again, a little risky, but also beneficial. At the end of the day, right, in order to achieve these critical success factors, what you're really talking about is building a robust community of participants and engaged. And again, as I said, this room represents the nucleus of that engaged community. This is a huge, diverse industry ecosystem. It's an international ecosystem. You have international players that end up representing other governments. It's incredibly difficult. And what I always tend to focus on when we are working on projects like these is the incentive structures, right? Why is someone doing what they are doing? What do you want them to do, and how can you align the incentives? And it sounds really simple and stupid, I know, but it's a very complicated game. At the end of the day, that is the game here, right? How do you take as many of the people in this ecosystem as possible and give them good incentives to want to participate? I think if you had gone prior to how I started these remarks, and you'd, in the 3G world or 4G world, if you'd gone to DoD and said, hey, guess what? I think you should put a bunch of money, time, and effort toward open source software, they would have said, are you crazy? Absolutely not. Like, we don't want an open source RAN. We want people building to our own, no spec, deeply secure, and I don't want anybody else to know it, that they can't even know that it exists. And all of a sudden you're seeing, right, that's turned on its head, and that's because the incentive structure turned on its head, right? DoD can't get that anymore. They can't move the market the way that they might have otherwise. And so instead, they've taken this approach, which has a different set of players and a different set of incentives and a different community. And the goal here, the job, is to align those incentive structures. How do you get somebody who may be skeptical or whose business plan may be entirely built on proprietary software stacks and say, yes, but there's a good reason for you to participate here, or at least track it, or at least not hate it, right? You may not love it and you may not want to use it, but you can participate because there's benefits here you'll get out of this. Whether it's through insights as to what the federal government wants, or the opportunity to get contracts from the federal government, or whatever else the incentive structure is. How do you align those incentives? To me, at the end of the day, that is one of the biggest factors to success. And I think a little bit of the job we have in NSC with the Linux Foundation, SRS and DeepSig and FutureG, the sort of core team working on this. It is our job, right? Is try to figure out, why is the industry doing what it's doing? Why are these players doing what they're doing? How can we influence their behavior by creating a different incentive to do something a little differently? The last point I'll make here is that, again, if you look at this list of critical success factors, this doesn't reach liftoff without a robust developer ecosystem. So I'll come back to the fact that that's, one of the reasons why this room is so important. At the end of the day, if we don't have, outside of what we know will be Herculean efforts by SRS and DeepSig to get the initial project up and off the ground, if you don't have a robust set of participants and developers using this, testing it, building for it, iterating on it, you can't get it to go from here to there. So I would say maybe that's the most critical of the critical success factors. And it's something that we and our friends and partners at the Linux Foundation will be very focused on over the next 3 years. Last thing I'll put up here in terms of new information before I see if there's any questions is just so that you understand sort of who's on the team and who's doing what. NSC through its OTA and in partnership with the FutureG office will be sort of providing the oversight, both the sort of community gathering oversight, the bits and pieces about following the rules and who's allowed to see what and how and when and how this interacts with an open source project. I think, as far as I know, the first time the NSC has ever done anything like this with a fully built open source community, which again, the Linux Foundation will be developing, managing, and doing what they do there, and will then interface with NSC and with the federal government in a very careful way to make sure that we, maintain the rules and regulations for this project. But we will sort of be looking at it from that holistic point of view, the top of the public-private partnership. How do we put the right people in the right places in this ecosystem and make sure that it's moving along down the way? Our friends at DoD on the left-hand side there will be, obviously driving the requirements and pushing forward on the use cases. Hey, this has come up. How are we going to address this? Who's built something to address that? The Linux team, again, will be focused, like a laser on taking this nucleus of interested community members, developing it, growing it, expanding it, taking its feedback, and trying to get it to more or less stand on its own 2 feet, right? More or less stand up as a robust and ongoing effort, ideally forever, right? It's a foundation on purpose, right? It's meant to be a foundation, both in the sense of, an underpinning, but also a foundation as in a thing that persists beyond any one individual player. And then obviously both on the industry side, the NSC has about 300 members. Most of them are the biggest players that are going to be in this space, whether they're on the RAN or the vendor side or in the DIB, eventually when you're talking about building solutions for DoD and the use cases. And then also the academic and research side of things. Many of those entities are also members of NSC. That's one of the benefits that I think we bring to this. And it is, hopefully I've made the point here a couple of times, that is an important long-term piece of the vision, right? If you have the researchers who are building the next solutions using OCUDU in their labs with their students as the basis of their technology development, there is a huge long-term benefit to that. And that's a big piece of the thinking here. I want to make sure that I emphasize that. And then finally, we will work closely with other industry groups and standards bodies and others as this develops to make sure that it's aligned well with, both US-based, like ANADIS goals, as you mentioned, as was mentioned, the ANADIS requirements form the foundation of what it will go into OCUDU initially, and obviously those will change, adapt, and grow, and we will try to work to change, adapt, and grow those alongside. All right, with that, I think I have adequately summarized as we went. I am very happy to take questions. Hopefully I did not besmirch FutureG or Martin's slides, but I'm very grateful and thanks for your time. John.
Sure. Don't know if this is a hand grenade or
it's okay. I'll take hand grenades.
Looking at the DoD's list of things that the impact factors and success factors,
yep.
None of it seems to be linked to ORAN heights or ORAN modularity.
Yeah.
What's the relationship here?
That's a good question. It's probably not one I can answer on their behalf. I sense neither any hostility toward ORAN nor necessarily any requirement that all of this fit directly within. I mean, obviously this is built on ORAN from the beginning, right? There's this OCUDU does not come about but for the developments that have happened in ORAN. Whether or not it's specifically linked to that standard and where it goes, I don't necessarily know. I do know that also the thinking behind ORAN and some of that is embedded here. And so I don't see it. I don't see daylight. I also don't see a requirement. Maybe that's the best answer I can give. Really.
I think John kind of answered a question asked the same question that I asked. But, when we look at how the DoD acquires technology, it's usually like an appliance, right?
Yep.
So when you get down to acquiring software, it's always been an issue.
Yep.
You either have the partners or the company to place the software in. I struggle with this every day for some work for companies. Part of an overran company, we're trying to get our software set DoD solutions. So my question is, within some of the things that I've seen here, the missing aspect is the acquisition strategy for something like this, right? If you look at it from the side of the commercial, it's a driving factor to have the software included into various solutions because it's commercial support, right? I know that there's been some recent changes in how the department plans to acquire technologies.
Yep.
I think XSET had to be a couple of days back.
Yep.
How does that align to this here? Like, how does that feed in?
So one thing I can tell you for sure is that I view OCUDU as akin to some of the MOSA requirements, right? In other words, you could, and again, I don't speak for DoD, but you could imagine future solicitations for systems that require RF to either preference and or require them having been built on OCUDU. In other words, I can imagine a statement in a solicitation that said something like, DoD has invested in the building of an open source 5G, 6G stack. That stack is its preferred solution for the future development. And this goes a little bit, John, to your question, right? Like whether or not there's an ORAN requirement, you could imagine because DoD had something to do with the R&D and development, and because there is a 5G.mil version of this open source framework, you could imagine in the future a requirement in a solicitation that said, we either will give extra credit to someone, just like MOSA, right? Extra credit if you're plug and play, if you believe MOSA to be fucking, but or it's a requirement. You must, eventually if this ecosystem and this software is robust enough, you must build your solution on the basis of OCUDU. And that may be the answer to your question. And again, I think that's a part of the innovation here in the OCUDU project. Again, something that at least as far as I know, and as far as NSC is concerned, never happened before, that DoD is a willing participant in an open source project with the understanding that it becomes the baseline, the framework, the foundation for future solutions. And so I think you can imagine that coming down the pike.
Right.
Yep.
So is it possible that FutureG is looking at ADIS, MVP, minimum viable profile, as the mediator between OCUDU and the ORAN Alliance and other groups where China is either very active or dominant? Because I think ADIS and the ADIS MVP is sourced from ORAN Alliance 3GPP, but very closely focused on North American needs, priorities, and also those that are friends and allies.
I mean, yes, I think that's
probably the strategy, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the best I can answer because I don't speak for them, but that is a very logical set of assumptions. Yeah.
The questions for on John at the RTP for OCUDU specifically lists the ORAN Alliance specifications. Is that right? The architecture that is required is the build of the ORAN Alliance architecture. So basically.
And the last thing, can I take one more? I'll take one more, and then,
I think I think like medium model it's you get like the C5 ISR Center, United Way, maybe some 3-letter interested parties to buy something to ball and work on it to contribute to this win to how they want to make them happy. And the other thing I think that might be is the big primes. Right? Who are the big radio manufacturers? So I think about DoD, they'll prepare for 8 years. System. Those needs had to change since I got, black hair. So the big prime, he's like Paris. They drive this technology every day. So you gotta get that food chain. It's the big hives.
Yep.
For just to kind of move out and use. Like good technology just dies without paper.
Well, great. Thank you, Sal. Thanks, everyone. And now the last thing I'll say is that while our OUSD, RNE, and FutureG friends are prohibited from speaking publicly, at least one of them is here. And so if you want answers that are not caveated with, I don't work for the government, David Kirkwood is in the back, and I would bet you willing to have a cup of coffee with you over one of the breaks. So thanks, everyone.